everyone for being here today. I also want to acknowledge that we're meeting today on Darug land, and what I'm going to talk about today was mostly written on Portugal land, but it's really about Western Sahara, about the struggle for decolonization in Western Sahara. So some of this work was done in Western Sahara, and most of it was done in the refugee camps. So today's theme is messing with methods. And when I was invited to participate in the workshop, I was excited for the opportunity to reflect on anthropological methods and imagine how we might play with them. In my reading of it, the call for messing with was a call to play and to imagine how we might share and collectively build new visions for the discipline. So naturally, as I began to pull my notes together to share stories from the field, I reflected on my fieldwork and my writing to think about what worked and what didn't, what surprised me and what made me uneasy. Ultimately, I struggled to shift my focus away from the bits of my fieldwork that seemed disastrous or impossible or frustrating. So I thought I'd peel back some of the smooth analytical veneer and walk you through some of the moments of collapse and difficulty to show you how they might be generative and particularly productive. For me, the fieldwork bumps haunted me for some time because I felt relatively alone in them, and I was reluctant to use my personal shame, embarrassment, or mistakes as an analytic. But perhaps more significantly, I began turning the skepticism I encountered in the field to my writing. And I'm happy to say a bit more about that in the discussion, and Michael's already flagged a little bit of that. So my aim today is to walk you through some of my difficulties in a way that's productive and might refocus fieldwork and writing sensibilities. Now, I'm not taking this approach to suggest that you avoid my mistakes or strive for perfection. Instead, I want to use these surprises as something that is really allowing us to track the disjuncture between experience and expectation in order to dig more confidently, I hope, into the conceptual and political analysis that we're ultimately striving for. This isn't a method per se, but really a way of directing attention and analysis. So, nearly 24 hours after I was originally scheduled to arrive in the Sahrawi refugee camps, I finally made my way through my second passport control checkpoint in Tindouf, Algeria. Tindouf is a military province, but it's also the airport that services those traveling to the Sahrawi refugee camps. All arrivals must go through a second round of passport control, even though it's a domestic flight. I was fatigued after 48 hours of travel, but I was eager as I awaited my embarrassingly too large bag, it was ridiculous, to come off of this very, very short conveyor belt. As my bag emerged, I made my way to the belt and prepared for the heavy lift. The woman next to me was in her mid-50s, and she was wearing a melfa, the distinctive clothing of Sahrawi women. Without speaking, she immediately leaned over and helped me lift my bag. Shukran bezef, I said to her. Thank you so much, as we made eye contact. Shukran bezef, bezef, inti Maghribiya. Thank you so much, much. Are you Moroccan? The woman replied to me. La, ana nashi Maghribiya, ana taliba fi America. No, I'm not Moroccan. I'm a student from America. She switched to English and said, we don't say bezef here. Only Moroccans say bezef. And with that, the woman turned and walked away. Years before conducting this fieldwork, I'd studied Darija, which is Moroccan Arabic, in Rabat. It was during my time in Morocco that I first began to understand the centrality of Western Sahara in the context of Moroccan nationalism. It was completely off limits for discussion, which made me ultimately intrigued. But returning to the Algerian airport, the Sahrawi woman's underlying accusation was that I'd come in with the tongue of the colonizer. She wanted to know if I was in the camps to gain information that would facilitate Morocco's aim of permanent control over Western Sahara. So with that, my anxiety and my fieldwork was launched. Now, before I started my fieldwork, I spent a lot of time conceptualizing my project and my methods. I knew my fieldwork site wasn't going to be confined to a single site, but I had a clear sense of where I thought I needed to go, where I thought I needed to be to do the research I'd imagined. My fieldwork was narrowly defined. I had found, or so I thought, something extremely novel and curious. Surely it was the perfect project. I became particularly interested in the Sahrawi state in exile, which manages the Sahrawi refugee camps in Algeria and leads the fight for a UN referendum on decolonization. Sahrawis were displaced from Western Sahara during a 15-year war with Morocco, who seized the territory and continues to occupy it today. So Western Sahara still remains the last colony in Africa. I had learned that the Sahrawi state in exile was preparing for sovereignty by selling future rights to the territory's resources on the expectation of decolonization, and that they'd created deferred oil and gas contracts. This was to be my project. I was going to examine how the deferred contracts necessitated new legal and financial regimes for managing the contracts in the meantime. I was interested in the creation of property law, tax codes, mineral rights, and the promise of Sahrawi sovereignty from exile. I wanted to examine decolonized futures and how they were envisioned and enacted via these contracts, and what that made possible for Sahrawi refugees in the meantime. So off I went, or so I thought. I would do my fieldwork across 3 sites in order to examine the contract as an object embedded in networks of commodification. It was novel and exciting. I prioritized the refugee camps as the primary site of my research and paired that with time in London doing archival work and interviewing solidarity groups, and then finishing up in Australia, which is the site of the Sahrawi state's oil and gas headquarters, surprisingly, and home to the companies that hold contracts with future Sahrawi resources. So if you fly to Perth, you can find the companies that are buying Sahrawi future rights. I'd already received the go-ahead for my project from a number of high-ranking Sahrawi officials, and I expected my meeting with the Sahrawi representative responsible for processing my visa to be straightforward. I traveled from New York City to Washington, D.C. to meet him for lunch and begin the visa process. However, there were a lot of questions about my research interests and why I was doing it. Before the food came, we'd already had a debate about the merits of anthropology and its problematic origins. The Sahrawi representative described it as explicitly and exclusively exploitative as a discipline that took advantage of communities and equated it with spying. I tried to explain that I agreed with him to an extent, but that I believed in the ability of anthropology to work differently and better. It was partially why I found the contracts to be such a compelling object of inquiry. They offered the opportunity to analyze power, possibility, and refusal in a site that had been continuously overlooked and discounted. For the time, that was enough to satisfy him, but he warned me. He made the last anthropologist to visit the camps cry twice. This was my initial introduction to the anxiety and the weight of anthropology's legacy at the level of practice. Upon my arrival to the camps, I had a plan that would focus on Sahrawi contracts as the site of active resistance. I would go to the administrative headquarters. I would interview leaders. I would go to the Sahrawi archives, to members of parliament. I would discuss with them the Sahrawi contracts. And surely youth activists would be excited about these contracts as a political device and as my object of inquiry. Well, I was mistaken. Within the Sahrawi refugee camps, nobody cared about the contracts. Sure, some people knew of the contracts, but they didn't find them novel, nor did they understand my interest in them. I lined up interviews and visits to government offices in the camps to seek out the contracts, but nobody really seemed to know where they might be or who had the right expertise. I bounced from the Prime Minister's office to the Ministry of Information and everywhere in between. Some could speak to the contracts, but mostly they wanted to tell me that my interest was misplaced and that I should be looking at other, more pressing issues. I saw the contracts as political and economic opportunities, while many Sahrawis emphasized other pathways and other issues. I was taken to the Conference of Sahrawi Women and observed the political process, gender equity and democracy, international respect for law. Everywhere I went, I was redirected to issues focused on equity, on good governance, on the distribution of humanitarian aid. Now, these are certainly important issues, but they weren't my focus of research. I felt like I was continuously struggling for control over my project. Whenever I asked about the contracts, I was redirected to more important offices like the Minister for Culture and the Women's Union. But I was slow to realize that my hunts for the contract made me too focused. I was too consumed by the fear that I'd have to report back to my supervisors and explain that I'd failed altogether. It took me quite some time to settle into the realization that I needed to think differently about my approach to doing fieldwork, and that doing so didn't require me to forego my broader research focus. I'd underestimated the centrality of international expectations on shaping the performance of the struggle. What I came to realize was that the UN's focus on gender and the languages with governance was seen as a fundamental first step to the decolonization struggle. The contracts were nothing if the state couldn't first demonstrate the qualities that made it a quote-unquote good state. I could still focus on the contracts, but I needed to situate them within the international norms and not as exceptional. Over time, it became clear that the sense of exceptionality and my focus on the novelty of the contracts as an object was part of what concerned people. The whole point for Sahrawis was to prove that the contracts weren't novel. They were part of the banality of preparing to be a state. Sahrawi leaders pointed to governance of the refugee camps as evidence of the future state's capabilities to smoothly transition into a fully fledged sovereign state. The state would be prepared to operate within norms and abide by best practices in the international community. The contracts I sought were meaningless if they weren't underpinned by normative articulations of the state. So, when I inquired about the contracts, I was constantly redirected to normative demonstrations of the state and would-be Sahrawi citizens. For example, every 4 years, the Sahrawi state holds democratic elections, and foreign visitors are invited to the camps to observe the process. I was one of them. After the second full day of the Sahrawi state's electoral process, foreign visitors were left to our own schedules. However, Sahrawi men began lining up to fill back into the meeting hall. With my badge still around my neck, I too lined up in an attempt to return to the meetings, though I was confused as to why they weren't on my schedule. As I reached the threshold of the door, I was quickly blocked by 2 Sahrawi military officials who shook their head and informed me that I was not allowed to enter. This was for a select but large group of political party members. 2 Sahrawi officials, whom I'd come to know quite well over the course of my research, saw the interaction, and they offered to negotiate my entrance to the evening's meetings. Independently of each other, both men had previously suggested that I might be a spy, and explained that I was being refused entry because of the Sahrawi leadership's inability to trust anybody after being colonized by Spain and then Morocco. The meeting that I'd been denied entry to was said to be particularly sensitive because it was intended as a space for people to raise questions and concerns about local leadership and governance strategies. Ultimately, the 2 officials obtained a compromise from the organizers, who allowed me to attend the session for 30 minutes. Accompanied by the 2 officials, I was escorted to the very back of the room, while they sat beside me and filled me in on the backstories and details to the questions raised, and a bit of gossip too. After exactly 30 minutes, organizers quickly escorted us to the door. While I won't detail any of the content of the questions and the concerns, they were entirely unremarkable and could have been raised in nearly any town hall I've observed. I quickly thanked the officials for their help and left to find one of the Sahrawi delegates with whom I'd begun a conversation earlier in the day. Upon finding the delegate, I mentioned that I'd just come out of the meeting, and he was surprised. He said that meeting was intentionally limited. Quote, "There could be people here working for Morocco. Any information about questions and challenges posed to the Sahrawi leadership might be used against Sahrawis and limit their possibilities for independence." The delegate reiterated that the leadership must be careful. Morocco might use anything as a weapon against them while they fight for sovereignty. Consequently, debate, dissent, and change was perceived to pose at least some threat to the legitimacy of the struggle, but it was also fundamentally tied to the democratic process, which created this sort of back and forth tension around what could be visible and what couldn't. So it was only once I grappled with and embraced the realization that I was perceived as an audience for the demonstration and declaration of the Sahrawi state in exile's commitment to good governance, that I was able to rethink and reconsider what was happening in the moments in which my potential status as a spy was questioned. So I want to turn to those moments and offer some reflections on them. The accusations of spying and the more general concerns that someone might be a spy continued throughout most of my fieldwork. Sometimes the accusations were paired with jokes, while others dug deeper into ethical questions about anthropology. My presence and research raised concerns, not only because my research was about natural resources, which Sahrawis often cite as the most success that they have against the Moroccan state. It's been their sort of big site of refusal. But it was also because I was an anthropologist. So I held these suspicions close throughout my fieldwork and later my writing, and continue to do so. I've pushed myself to pay attention to the accusations or reservations, noting every time they come up, as I suggest that they reveal other sorts of stakes with respect to knowledge production. These anxieties haunted me throughout my research. They've continued long after Sahrawi officials stopped questioning my intentions and started asking me to speak at public events. But they continue to form part of an undercurrent that guides my writing, and I want to bring these moments together for our purposes today. I take these suspicions seriously, but the prominence of these accounts and their concentration here is more of a reflection on how they echoed through my thoughts and actions, because I think when brought together, they reveal something larger. I suggest a move to scale out and consider the larger picture and the tensions that these moments reveal in order to recognize the landscape of international diplomacy in which they exist. In my eagerness to assuage fears and prove that I was not a corporate or diplomatic spy, fears that seemed rational in the context of my research focused on future-based oil contracts, I initially missed what I was being told. I understood that some of the questions I posed during my fieldwork unsettled Sahrawi leaders, but I thought that the problem could be rectified by withdrawing them and redirecting conversations away from sensitive proprietary information about the oil contracts. But ultimately, these concerns extended beyond the release of proprietary information and caused concerns because of the premises I took for granted as a researcher. This is not to suggest that my consideration of the deferred contracts and their counterparts was entirely misguided, but what might these anxieties tell us, and why did the formulation of my questions cause such concern? At the outset of my research, I wanted to critique the conceptual and theoretical limitations of bounding an ethnographic field site at the expense of losing particular lines of sight, most specifically that of political struggles for decolonization. I was most concerned with how the territorialized field site, one that bound people and place together in a narrow framing, created a blind spot that might miss methods through which displaced people have made political claims and how they have possessed and utilized territory from exile. My fieldwork was driven by an attention to how these claims of possession might be authored and maintained, taking particular note of their efficacy and the new possibilities that accompanied a temporal and spatial reauthoring. However, these questions were informed by the anthropological theory I sought to critique. My questions and general surprise about the Sahrawi-led oil and gas contracts, made possible by what I suggested were new and exciting ways of exercising ownership and possession from exile, implied that the threads I was following throughout my research were exceptional. My premise that Sahrawi refugees and the state in exile needed to find strategies that would bypass the Moroccan state in order to use their own land centered the Moroccan state's occupation and legitimacy within my question. My questions gave away my sense of surprise in the fact that the land was being used by those who'd been dispossessed and exiled. And as such, I replicated the same limits of anthropological theory that I was simultaneously seeking to critique.